Are near-death experiences real? That is the question on today's Newsmakers. We are playing a section of my new podcast, Into the Supernatural. It's a show I co-host with Jen Lilly. She is an actress, and she joins me each and every episode to break down major issues in the Christian realm that fall under the supernatural. A lot of really incredible subject matter that we are talking about on this show. And today it is John Burke. He is joining us to talk about near-death experiences. Are they real? What does the Bible say? And what has he uncovered in his research? With no further ado, here is John Burke. Well, John Burke, it is super exciting to reconnect with you and have you on today. A lot to talk about. We're going to talk about near-death experiences. And I know this is a loaded question because it's a complicated backstory, but what was it that motivated you, that drove you to want to tackle NDEs?
Well, it was kind of an accident. I was an agnostic. Grew up going to church, but I ended up studying engineering and working as an engineer. So my mind has always worked like that, like skeptical. How do you know? Is there any evidence? Why does that make sense? And nobody could really answer my question. So I just decided Jesus is probably a good man who turned legend, and God, you just can't know. There's no evidence. And then my dad was dying of cancer. And, this is almost 40 years ago. And someone gave him the very first research on near-death experience. So coined the term near-death experience, which if you don't know what that is, it's when people clinically die. So like even no heartbeat, no brain waves for minutes to hours. And yet they're resuscitated either by modern medicine or, quite honestly, some cases just miracle, because there's no way you can't explain it any other way. But I saw this book on his bedside table and I pick it up and I'm curious. I start reading it and I couldn't put it down. And at the end I said, oh my gosh, like this might be the evidence I've been looking for. And because so many of them, they talk about how they were in a place more real than this, more alive than this, and many times in the presence of this God of light and love, who was personal, who knew them intimately. They never wanted to leave his presence. Many of them knew this was Jesus or saw him as Jesus. And again, I'm a skeptic and an agnostic. I'm like, what? And it was just enough. It didn't convince me. It just opened my mind. And because of that, I actually started reading the Bible and studying the Bible. And after a year or so, for other reasons, actually for fulfilled prophecy in history that I didn't know was there either, I came to faith in Christ. So, the weird thing is I just kept, my curiosity was insatiable. I was always like, the more I learned about the Bible and studied, and then I kept running into more of these stories, which interestingly, God, I believe, I was working as an engineer out in Santa Barbara, California, which ended up to be the hub of the research that the medical doctors who were the first researchers, where they were studying most of the patients.
Wow, no way. That's incredible.
So yes, coincidentally,
yeah,
I kept running into them, and and the way my mind would go, I'd be like, wait, I heard that. And that person talked about a life review, and that person talked about this. And I see that's where Jesus said this and I literally started charting it. And I gave my first talk on this at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1989. Wow. So I've studied close to 1,500 cases of clinical death and resuscitation since then. And, in 2015, I wrote the book, Imagine Heaven, really showing how there are about 40 commonalities of what people say.
Yeah.
And all 40 are found in the Bible.
It's incredible.
And and then a year and a half ago, I wrote Imagine the God of Heaven, really honing in on how people all over the globe, 70 people I interviewed on every continent, every religious background, but they're encountering the same God. And it's the God who revealed himself in the Jewish prophets and through Jesus. And I'm just basically showing how the character and the attributes of who they're experiencing fully aligns.
One of the things that I really love, and I don't know the statistics, and I know that you do, is how many people basically in any given day around the globe die, and then how many of those have a near-death experience. I think it was like 5% or something, but do you recall this statistic?
Yeah. Well, the Gallup poll did a survey of America and found 1 out of 25 Americans. So that's like 13 million Americans claims to have had a near-death experience. More recently, in 2019, the European Academy of Neurology reported on a study across 35 countries. They said that 10% of the population across 35 countries has had a near-death experience. Now,
that's fascinating to me.
I still think it's more like 5%, because when I dove into the data, the ones who were actually at or near clinical death, more like 5%. So here's the thing, like, I'm still a skeptic. So if someone has an experience and they call it a near-death experience, but they're not really clinically dead or very, very close, I'm kind of like, I don't know, maybe. I mean, you kind of got to take
or is it a
word,
vision? Is it a vision at that point, right? Is it some sort of,
it could be,
right?
It could be, but I got to tell you, when they show you scars in their neck where the knife went in here and came out there, or the bullet wounds, or hospital records, dead an hour and 45 minutes, well, that to me has a lot more like, okay, tell me what you have to say.
Yeah, exactly. So 4% of Americans on average, because 1 in 25 is what you said, and then like about 10 global, but we're thinking like 5 is a fair assessment.
I think 4 to 5% is 1 out of 20, 1 out of 25.
Which is still thousands of people a day across the globe that are experiencing this. And one of the things I love about your books, and I really appreciate about your skepticism, is that, you note in these books that I'm obsessed with, that that you only really take the testimonies of people who have a lot to lose. So they're not people that are telling this story because, they're going to be gaining fame or their moment in the spotlight. These are people, lawyers, doctors. I recall one with an astronaut or something like that, an aerospace, physicist or something like that, where
lawyer, aerospace engineer, surgeons.
I mean, a normal
bank presidents.
You don't typically have say, I died and went to heaven, or I died and went to hell, because you sound insane. No. And so I love that these are the testimonies that you've included in here, because they understand, they have such conviction about what they experienced, that they have a lot to lose. They have a lot to lose. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing with this, because you have, I mean, even within the church, and you know this, John, because you've gotten this reaction from people too. There are people who will say this is not biblical, this is not true, this is not, and I want to get into all this, but it makes it hard to share the stories, A, because they feel strange, Jen, like what you were just saying, but B, when even the people in your own camp who should support what you may be saying, and again, we should have skepticism always and vet things, they're coming after you. So it's not just the atheists and the agnostics, it's the Christians too sometimes who are struggling with this. Why do you think that is?
Oh yeah, I think I know why that is, because that's why I stayed quiet, having done all this research for so many years. I say that, it literally took me 35 years to write Imagine Heaven, because I had a lot of questions too. And look, I do not believe everything every near-death experiencer says.
Sure.
I don't, and I don't encourage people to. And that's because these people are having an experience that's truly multidimensional, and so they're having to interpret somewhat what they're experiencing. But what I like to use an analogy, like imagine we're living this three-dimensional experience, right, on a flat black and white painting in this room.
This is my favorite analogy in your book, by the way.
Okay.
Such a good analogy.
I've used this with people I've interviewed that have had near-death experience, and they say exactly that's why it's so difficult to talk about, and why they often stay quiet. Because how do you explain something they say is more real than this?
And so to use your analogy, though, it's like as if when they died, they come out of this 2D black and white painting into the room, and
Which
they
is
look
three
back,
dimensions.
which is like 3 dimensions, and they
Yeah,
look
and
at the
think
painting.
so if you live if we're experiencing this experience in a 2-dimensional world, we have up and down, we have side to side. We can't even conceive of in or out. There's no dimension called in or out.
Right.
So death means separation. So imagine at death, your soul is peeled, your 2-dimensional soul is peeled off that 2-dimensional body. And now your soul is experiencing both 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions in this room of color, and you can observe what's going on in your flat 2-dimensional world because it's contained within this greater 3-dimensional reality. And then you're pressed back in, you're resuscitated in 2 dimensions, and you're struggling with words to describe multi-dimensions and color and black and white 2-dimensional terms. And
right.
So they're having to grapple for words and interpret. Now, what they do consistently say are they describe these 40 commonalities, and they describe things that also can be verified. And that's what started to convince me.
Okay.
Can you list some of those things?
Yes.
Sorry, Billy.
No, I'm sorry. It was your turn, but I was like, yes, please list these things. I need to hear them.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I'm working as an engineer. I've now become a follower of Jesus, but I'm still asking the questions there too, trying to figure things out. And I keep running into these, and I'm kind of categorizing them and all that. And I'm asking the same questions, like, well, how do you know these aren't hallucinations or, drugs or the brain being flooded with chemicals as the brain is dying, and these are all theories that, alternate explanations. Dr. Michael Shermer, who's a skeptic and an atheist, says, no, we know it's brain based. Well, there are several. In Imagine the God of Heaven, I go through 10 points of evidence that convince me this cannot be brain based, because brain based does not explain the evidence. So one is veridical observation. So they can make observations. So imagine you come, out of the 2-dimensional painting, but you're still looking at what's going on in the 2 dimensions while you're in 3. Well, that's exactly what happens when people die. They say they leave their bodies, but often they're up above their bodies in the room where their resuscitation is taking place. And they can observe and later report things that can be verified that are actually happening. So, for instance, I interviewed this cardiologist. A lot of the early researchers were cardiologists, and Dr. Michael Sabin, and he was a skeptic about near-death experiences. He thought, that's not true. I've never heard that from any patient. Well, then he started actually asking his patients, right? And then they start telling him again and again. And after 5 years of research, he actually wrote up an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, so JAMA. And what he said is, these patients were telling me things about what I did resuscitating them that they could not possibly have known, and so accurate that I could have used the recording to teach other physicians how to do resuscitation.
Wow.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. And, I report on, like in Imagine the God of Heaven, like, for instance, a woman in London who dies giving childbirth. She comes up out of her body. A lot of the commonalities, she travels through this portal or tunnel, this gorgeous world of beauty in the presence of this God of light who is love and knows her. Life review. And then God says, your son, Michael, is going to live. You need to go back because he's going to need you. So she comes back. And as she's coming back, she passes through the ceiling of the hospital and notices, the ceiling of the room where the resuscitation is taking place, and notices a sticker on the top side of the ceiling fan. This is in the 90s when they still had ceiling fans in hospitals. And she comes to, and she's so excited trying to tell the doctors and nurses about this incredible experience and meeting God. And they're like, yeah, you're hallucinating. And she gets one nurse and says, look, you did this and said this. And, and the nurse knew, wait, you were comatose. You couldn't have known that. You didn't have any heartbeat or brain waves. And Mary, the woman who had the near-death experience, said, I can prove it to you. Go get a ladder, look on the top side of the ceiling fan, and you're going to see a red sticker, and here's what it says. And sure enough, she got the ladder, and it checked out. Now, you could say, oh, good internet story, right? Because it sounds like that. But there are thousands of them, and they've been studied scientifically. So Dr. Janice Holden found, she did a study of about 100 cardiac arrest patients having near-death experiences, making observations that could be checked out. Each may make, 10, 15 observations. She found 92% of their observations were completely accurate. 92%. While they had no brain waves,
Right.
Another 6% were mostly accurate. Maybe some details varied. Only 2% were inaccurate, and that turned out to be one of the patients in the study.
Wow.
That's unbelievable. So as a skeptical engineer, I was like, okay, this is grounded in our reality. This is not hallucination. The second thing that convinced me is that when people blind from birth have a near-death experience, they can see. And I report on about 6 people that I interviewed or studied in the 2 books, Imagine Heaven and Imagine the God of Heaven. And to me, that is like, that's mind-boggling because they report all the same things as sighted people. Wow. And interestingly, one of the things that convinces me that, like a non-believer skeptic might not get, but all the blind people say if they experienced heaven, they talk about the light of heaven was not like the light on earth. Now, remember, they're blind when they died, and when they're resuscitated, they're still blind. So they've only felt the sun's light, right? They say this light was so brilliant that they knew they couldn't look at it if they were in their normal body on earth and had eyesight. And the light was palpable, they say. It was love and life all together as one. And it was coming out of everything, coming out of the grass, coming out of the trees and the birds and the flowers and even the people, this welcoming committee of people coming toward them. Now, blind people talking about the light of heaven, interestingly, most Christians don't even know. That's what Isaiah says in Isaiah 60. There is no sun or moon in heaven, for God is its light. And then John sees the holy city of God and reports in Revelation 21, there's no sun or moon, for the glory of God is its light. And the Lamb, meaning Jesus, is the lamp, and the nations will walk in that light. Now think about that. That's exactly what blind people are reporting. And of course, we always wonder, what is the glory of God? It says in Romans 8, we will share in God's glory if we share in his suffering. So what does that mean? Well, the glory of God is not only this light, but the very love of God, because God is love, and the life of God. Remember, Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. So light and love and life, that's filling and giving energy to everything and coming out of everything. And it's amazing because all these things, like Jesus even talked about that. Matthew 13, he says, and then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom forever.
Yeah.
Right? And the welcoming committee, in Luke 16, he says, use your worldly resources to make friends.
Yes.
So that when it's all gone, they will welcome you into an eternal home.
John, this has been amazing. We want to have you back for a part 2 because there's actually more to unpack on this. And I mean, I feel like Jen said, we could have 10 hours of conversation with you and we wouldn't even scratch the surface. So we want to have you back again. And we appreciate you joining us on the show today.
No, I'd love to. And it was great talking with you guys.
Now, if you want to hear the entire episode with John Burke, that was just the first part of it. You can head on over to supernaturalshow.com. You can also find Into the Supernatural wherever podcasts are heard. We are also on YouTube as well. It is a much longer conversation, and you can again check it out at supernaturalshow.com. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Newsmakers. We'll see you then.